My name's Ben Sopchak. I've been with Lagunitas about 3 years now. I'm currently living in Denver, Colorado. I'm responsible for what we call our one-hitter series, which is all of our breweries sort of limited, one-off, specialty, kind of barrel aged, sour, blended, whatever, vintage, Birkin, all the fancy stuff. I do that for what we call the High Plains region, basically Minnesota down through Texas. So I live in Colorado and bounce around pretty good, and am recently getting into the St. Louis market. So thank you so much for having me. It's really awesome. Definitely want to start by thanking Chad and the Sister Rose crew for having us in. Ryan, Carolyn, our Lagunitas crew that holds it down here in Missouri, and then some of the Summit distributing guys that keep our beer moving and flowing. So they've all been essential for me. Thanks a lot. Real quick about myself, I like to say I have beer in my blood. My mother was involved with quality control for Anheuser-Busch at one of their breweries in upstate New York outside of Syracuse for a number of years. So she rode around on a big tricycle and tasted beer with all the big burly brewer guys when she was in her 20s and made sure it tasted the same. She also worked for Miller a little bit, all before I was born, so got into it at a fairly young age. Been kind of enthusiastic about it for as long as I can remember. Catalyst of all that, I think, was I was playing football in college. I was 18 or 19. I had a serious brain injury, really bad, like year to recover, spoke with a stutter. It was just really troubling stuff. And at the time I was in college, so I was living in a fraternity house, and it was like buy pallets of expired beer for $50 and drink kegs upside down and that kind of thing. So craft beer was not really part of what we were doing on the day-to-day. And after all this time went by and I started feeling better, the doctor said, hey, I know you're in college, you're drinking, you're in this high consumption environment kind of deal, so you can drink 6 beers a week. He's like, I don't care if you drink all 6 in an hour or if you have one a night, it doesn't matter. But if you drink any more than that, it's going to slow down your recovery and you're not going to get your skills back, whatever. Not sure I got them all back, but this was like the greatest blessing for me. So I would really get different beers every week and really go on the website and put it in the right glassware, and I just kind of taught myself all this before I was ever 21, and I was just super into it. Moved to Colorado for some grad school about 6 years ago and worked as a brewer at a small brewery called the Brew on Broadway, colloquially the Bob. It's a 7-barrel brewery, completely English style. I mean, it's ESB, Russian Imperial Stout, English Pale, old ales, things like that. So not the sexiest beer to make necessarily, and certainly not the most popular to drink, but I learned a lot there, the scale up from the home brew. We did all of our own yeast propagation and harvesting and things like that, and that's what I'm going to talk about tonight, is yeast, which is sort of an ironic thing for Lagunitas, because for a really long time, like 20-something years, we used very few yeast strains. Almost every Lagunitas beer that we made was made with the same yeast strain, a more or less flavorless ale yeast type, which for those who don't know is just kind of designed to be in the background behind grain, behind hops, not the primary flavor agent of the beer. So I would have thought I would come in and talk about hops. We have so much cool stuff going on with our hop partners, and that's every beer we make is hoppy, pretty much. So it's a unique thing to talk about, but also a sort of apropos subject for us. We've recently started with this one-hitter program, introducing a lot of really cool new yeast strains to the brew house. With our brewery up and running in Chicago now, it's liberated the brewers in California to do a little bit more experimentation with things, ingredients and processes that we've never endeavored to deal with at all before. So it's a really exciting time for Lagunitas, specifically on the yeast side of things. I think it gives us a really cool opportunity to talk about some of that stuff. So Lagunitas, for those who don't know, started in Northern California, Forest Knolls, town of Lagunitas, kind of hopped around a few little locations when we first got started. The brewery started, Tony McGee, 1993, he's our owner, founder, original brewer, making beer on his stove, not unlike most other breweries I would imagine. Had a small house fire with the things bubbling over and was asked by his wife to kindly leave and start a brewery somewhere else or give it up. So he moved down the street and before too long was asked to leave the town as well. This is cool because it's yeast related, so it's kind of full circle here with beer school tonight. the town that he was in, a very small municipal water system, and he's rinsing, at the time fairly small, I think a 15-barrel brew house. There's a lot of yeast and sediment and whatnot in there, so cleaning these tanks, rinsing into down the sewer, and before it's gone, people's sinks and toilets are bubbling up, because there's active fermentation going on in the pipes, and completely overwhelmed the system, and he was asked to move out of there as well. So ended up in Petaluma not too long after. Went to an 80-barrel brew house at that point, and expanded across the street in the early 2000s to a quite large 250-barrel brew house, which is newer. Opened a brewery in Chicago last summer that has two 250-barrel brew houses in it, and we're currently working on one in Azusa, which is Los Angeles-ish. That's going to have 3 250s in it when it's open. So lots of growth. Recently went into all 50 states with our beer. Recently went to places like Europe, Mexico, Australia, some Asia, Scandinavia. So it's getting out there pretty good. Good? Live? Hello? I'll just continue to project. Great. Great. So with that, we're going to talk about yeast with each one of these beers. I don't want to tell you anything you already know if you're homebrewers or beer. It's too lame, just let me know. And similarly, if we get too far down the rabbit hole of beer nerdism, chuck something my way and we'll scale it back. First beer we're tasting here is called Nighttime, and this is really fun because this is not your conventional, I don't think anyway, tasting progression. It's not the Pilsner, the Pale, the IPA, the Stout. We're going to jump all over stylistically, sort of progressing with yeast in terms of the process, the flavor profile of the yeast. This is definitely the most simple of the yeast that we do. This is our house ale yeast. It's similar to what you would use as like a California ale or even a safe ale like 05 or something in your homebrew. Really basic stuff, and for a long time this was really the only ale yeast that we used. This is intended to be not a primary flavor agent in the beer. It's about the grain and it's about the hops. The yeast is interesting though in that it reacts uniquely to a number of different inputs depending on what beers are fermented with it. And you'll know between our IPA, Little Something Something, Daytime, Maximus, Hop Stoopid, any of the seasonals, Undercover Shutdown, any of those beers, they're all made with this yeast. So it's a whole lot of different manifestations. It's very, very versatile, but it's intentionally not particularly flavorful. So you're really kind of appreciating what we call a blackish IPA. 8.2%, and it's bounced around different seasons. We haven't really found a spot in the calendar for it. It's been in 6-packs, it's been in bombers, it's been in kegs. This yeast is sort of the foundational, or something like it is foundational in any brewery. It's going to do the classic, turn your sugar, water into alcohol and CO2 with very, very little byproducts. No sort of additional products of fermentation that you might have with certainly some of the Belgian strains that we're going to taste, and certainly any of the wild yeast that we're going to try as well. So, designed to be simple. Are people fairly familiar with fermentation as an idea and how this works? Yeast grows. As soon as you have enough, you would add it to what's called wort, which is simple sugar extracted from starch conversion in malted grain, usually barley, but also things like wheat and rye and oats and stuff as well. Yeast digests the sugar from the grain, or fruit in some cases, or anything really. Honey could be any sugar source really, and produces alcohol on one hand and carbon dioxide on the other hand, which for the most part will bubble out of a fermenter and be reintroduced later during carbonation. So that's the kind of the 101 of how yeast works. This beer, dark, roasty malts, and sort of piney hops. I don't like to tell people what to taste in Lagunitas beer. I like it to be kind of your own thing. It's like, look for the mango. It's not like that. It's like whatever you taste is cool. We all taste it a little differently. But for me, this is unique in hoppy beer in that the hops are kind of all in the front. Usually the trajectory is that the hops are
kind of the finishing element, and here they're I think more robust in the beginning and certainly in the aroma of the beer. So that's nighttime, and this yeast was the yeast of Lagunitas. We have a Pilsner, a lager yeast as well, which we also use as kind of the two yeasts that we maintained at the brewery for the longest time. Lagers, as you may well know, are cold fermented or bottom fermented beers. Typical ale yeast fermentation would happen between, let's say, 67 and 72 degrees. That's kind of an optimal temperature gradient for an ale yeast of this nature. With lagers, you're looking at the 55 to 58 range, depending on what you're making. So it's a much slower fermentation. Heat is a catalyst of fermentation. So the colder it is, traditionally, the slower it will ferment. And if it's an ale yeast and it gets too cold, it won't ferment at all. If it's a lager yeast and it gets too warm, it'll taste disgusting. So there's a lot of 1 degree in fermentation temperature over a 2-week fermentation will make a lot of difference in flavor, in texture, all sorts of different adjuncts in the yeast. Are we feeling good about yeast? Simple, flavorless ale yeast?
What does everybody think of this beer? Do you think he's getting dirty enough or too dirty at this point?
3 or 4 large kind of commercial players at least at like the American beer level that you can buy yeast from, and all together, even though a lot of them are very similar offshoots of one another, there's probably 100 that would be sort of common in the brewing lexicon. Maybe 75 would be more realistic, but yeast in general is everywhere. Every breath we take, I mean, there's yeast. It's everywhere. It's in our hair. It's everywhere. Maybe my hair specifically, but it's almost like getting a cold or something. Like any hundreds of millions of bacteria can give you a cold, but to identify and isolate which one it is sometimes impossible. And that's why I think yeast is the sexiest of all elements. I mean, we talk about hops and how amazing it is and, you know, all these different things that it do, and we talk about organic malted grain and the terroir involved with that, but yeast is like the last frontier. It's like only recently cool in craft beer, and we're only starting to sort of understand the potential of what yeast can do because there are so many. So outside of the however many cultured brewers yeast, you know, let's call it 100-ish, there's also infinite atmospheric yeast strains which can be isolated and propagated and used to ferment beer. And so much of that is unknown, which is just amazing. A lot of the wild beers, particularly the lambic types of Belgium, are open fermented, as in they don't add a yeast pitch to wort post-boil. They leave beer open in any number of really open vessels. A common one is called a cool ship, like a very narrow, wide, almost like a petri dish. And it's designed for atmospheric yeast to settle into the beer and start the fermentation, completely independent of cultured yeast. So the answer to the question is infinite, really. But it's like space, man. We don't know shit about it. Totally, yeah. And I also like to think of like yeast as kind of like your kids, right? Like if you have the resources to do so, you would want to give them every advantage to succeed. Like maybe a private school, a new pair of tennis shoes, like you read to them at night, you make sure they drink enough water or whatever, stay away from the kids doing graffiti, I don't know. But like the whole idea is yeast is the same. Like you could put wort into a fermenter that has just been cold crashed to settle out the yeast onto a bed of yeast and just start over again. A lot of homebrewers do that. Like, I'm going to use this yeast 1,000,000 times. But it changes, and each generation of the yeast has different properties and efficiencies and byproducts of fermentation as well. So I'm kind of a believer, a firm believer in, you know, at least at the homebrew level, I mean, it costs $5 for a yeast pitch. Buy a new one and get it warm and oxygenate your wort and add it in and give it every opportunity to get going. And use a lot of it. I mean, there's nothing wrong, I don't believe, with an overpitch of yeast in a homebrew. Some people are tracking with me here, I think. So if you're making a beer with a California-type ale yeast, with a flavorless yeast like the one we just tasted, using a lot of cells, like even double what you might normally use, is not a bad idea. Because if the temperature is controlled correctly, there's nothing bad that can come out of it, and you're going to rack it off after 10 days or 2 weeks anyway. So all the extra cells that make the beer taste weird when they're dead or settled out will never impact your beer whatsoever. So I'm a huge fan of an over pitch right off the bat to get a cleaner, more complete, more active, vibrant fermentation going right away. Yes. Exactly. Yeah. Yes. In the recipe as an extra fermentable to increase the alcohol at the end. And what happened, brown sugar, do we know brown sugar is a Lagunitas beer? People familiar with that one? So that beer was actually born as out of a fuck up of making this one, which is when the brewer switched over, Tony went kind of hired a brewer to do the day-to-day work of the brewery, and there was no note of honey at all in the recipe. So they brew up Gnarlywine, and they say, what the hell? It's half the gravity that it's supposed to be at. Why is it so low? What did I do wrong? Calls him up. He said, well, did you put the honey in? He said, what honey? There's no honey in this recipe. So, oh shit. So there's no honey available. It's like Christmas week. So they go out all over Northern California. All the employees buy up all the little 2-pound bags of brown sugar they could find, go back and dump it in until the gravity is high enough, and then ferment it out, and it turned out to be everybody's favorite. So brown sugar came from an accident of making the original Gnarlywine, which was a honey-based beer. Now Gnarlywine, because of the price of honey, the inconsistency of honey from season to season, from provider to provider, it's impossible to make a consistent beer at a stable price with honey. When you're making 250 barrels of beer in a batch, it's a lot of honey. So they've tried to recreate or at least keep the beer relatively stable using grain in the place of honey, but this started off as a honey-based beer. And from a yeast standpoint, this would fall into the category of a high-gravity beer. Those would be things like old ales, barley wines, any other kind of very high alcohol. Original gravity, are you familiar with this term at all? It's basically a measure of sugar before we add yeast to start breaking it down. Typically, high-gravity beers or high-gravity ale yeast would be used in anything over 0.75 is a original gravity, but I think maybe like 0.85 would be more appropriate in the Lagunitas context. We have a lot of strong beers. Our house yeast is very efficient. It can ferment. Some yeasts are more vibrant in sort of vital than others. So some might only be able to ferment a beer to 7 or 8% alcohol by volume, and then it will sort of asphyxiate. Oh, there's too much booze in here. I'm not strong enough. I die. I settle down. I go away. Others, like our house yeast, can easily handle a 10%, 9-10% beer without a ton of problem. Can be done with a higher pitch rate. Just add a lot more yeast to the beer. Can also be accomplished with multiple pitches. This first fermentation is slowing down. It's done all it can do, and then you just add another fresh batch. And before it realizes how strong the beer is, it'll ferment a little before it says, shit, and then has to, it's too strong. So multiple ways to achieve this. The original gravity of this beer is like damn near 1. It's like 0.96 or something, which is a very sweet, thick, intense, grainy mash. It's one mash, It's very efficient, very strong. So this is probably it's among the strongest beers Lagunitas makes on a consistent basis. 10.1 for 2014. It's been everywhere from 9.6 to 11 over the years. I think the first year this beer was, mid 2000s, and it's come and gone and changed a little bit. But so higher gravity beers, this would be true of anything that you use additional fermentables to get your ABV high in the beginning. Things like honey, molasses, maple syrup, fruit purees, any of that stuff. Even dextrose or a simple sugar of kinds. So loosely a barley wine, American strong ale. Still not a particularly flavorful yeast strain. It's just designed to be able to ferment to much higher finer ABVs. What do you got? We're pretty, not quiet, but maybe dodgy. Like, it's one of those things where it's a ballpark, and it has always been a ballpark. I mean, I don't know what we say on the label. I don't think we do say on the label. I would estimate the nighttime to be in the mid to high 70s on the IBU, IPA-esque, fairly bitter in the end, but you get a lot of that from the grain. This would probably be just as high. This is an aggressively dry hopped beer. It was intensely alcoholic before the dry hop. That was one of the motivating factors of it being dry hopped in the first place, was to mellow it out a little bit. Fusel alcohols, do we know about that? Higher order type of alcohol has an additional carbon molecule. And some people can't process these. They can be like really harsh, like harsh alcohol, described as fusel alcohol, which is actually like a molecularly different type of alcohol. And when you get into these high gravity beers, particularly the ones that are fermented warm, you get some of those alcohols. So, you know, a couple of these might give some people a worse hangover than 15 Coors or something. Relatively speaking, I mean, alcohol is probably not the most radiant thing to consume a lot of. Malt liquor, I would say no worse than anything else within moderation. It's all sort of putting the same strain on your interior. I think there's some other stuff in malt liquor that makes it maybe not as good for you, but it's not the alcohol. It's the absence of grain in the place of, you know, synthetic sugars and shit like that. It's just stuff that's not natural in your system, but necessarily not really. Do we like the Gnarlywine? Ages well. It's kind of permanently stable, as it is that none of our beer is pasteurized. That's a huge part of the yeast conversation. Pasteurization is designed to make beer stable, increase the shelf life over time, particularly in packaged beer. Bottles and cans, but Lagunitas doesn't do that. So the beers are live. They're still living yeast in here. It's probably not doing much fermentation anymore, especially since the beer is stored cold, but it is an unpasteurized, theoretically living beer even from 2014. Questions? High gravity beers, fermentation in that type of regard? Clear? Cool? Cool. Next up, we have Tuberfest. Let's slam this Gnarlywine here. Great. It's still a little bit sweet. A lot of our beers are not allowed to ferment all the way out, which is interesting. So a lot of the fermentations will be stopped by what's called cold crashing. You know, getting the magic number in theory is 37 degrees. Turning, you know, the glycol down, you know, cooling the fermentation vessel down to a level where fermentation activity stops. And due to changing densities of active and inactive yeast, the yeast will flocculate, which basically means sink slowly to the bottom of the vessel. So it's a process to clarify beer, but also to stop it. So we get it to a target final gravity, which is, again, like final dissolved sugar in suspension measure. And from there, it's just finished. So you can tell, I mean, there's some residual sugar in this beer. Like, this could have been allowed, if the yeast was sort of active enough, this could have been fermented even stronger, and the final product would be drier, but it was cut short. It can take a really long time to get those final few points down, even with a really healthy yeast. So part of it's the interest of time, I think. You can't leave a beer like this in a fermenter for 6 months. But also just, it tastes really good as it is. So, Tuberfest. This is a one-hitter series beer, which I was mentioning is the program I'm responsible for in our region. It's all of our sort of new experimental, one-offy, smaller release kind of intriguing beers. Kind of, everyone's like, Lagunitas IPA is awesome, but where's the heady shit? Where's the barrel-aged beer? So here it is, the one-hitter series. So Tuberfest is a lager. Very loosely modeled on the Oktoberfest Marzen types of beer, German, Bavarian in origin. Similar from a grain composition, certainly. But this is our first beer with a lager yeast, our only beer with a lager yeast for tonight. So this is the cold fermentation. Lagering traditionally is a much longer process. It allows the beer to sort of take on a crisp property devoid of a lot of like the fruity sort of esters that you might get from an ale yeast fermenting quicker and warmer. It also works from the bottom. It settles quickly because it's cold, and it ferments very slowly, very, very slowly compared to a very vigorous ale yeast fermentation. So you end up with a not necessarily drier, but certainly at least theoretically crisper sort of beer, although this one is sort of grainy and sweet, so it's not a good use to make that point. Our Pilsner, Lagunitas Pils, would be a much better example of lager yeast in a traditional setting. This beer is cool because it's strong. It's 7.5, which is well above what you would see in certainly any of the imported, the Polanners or the Hofbraus this time of year. It's also made with a couple of really interesting, new, and not common hops that you see together. One's called Idaho 7, which this is there's a few others now out there at the sort of national level. This is one of the first beers to introduce the Idaho 7 hop, which is where the name comes from. It's like two bad jokes about potatoes. Tuberfest. Potatoes are tubers. Right. So this hop is really neat. It's big. It's like much larger than normal hops, but it also has sort of a reverse proportionality. So it's a little lower in the alpha acid. You're not seeing the citric bitterness that you get like the classic Lagunitas hop finish. It doesn't have that, but it still has a ton of hops. These hops are really cool. They're going to take over the world, I think, at some point. So look out for Idaho 7. Really, any hops from Idaho, that's kind of the next thing. The other hop is Nelson Sauvin, which is a really bright, sort of tropical, fruity sort of hop, which I think is a little bit lost to the grain in here, but it just makes the beer a little bit more round. It's just a lot more robust and flavorful than you would see in an imported marzen lager. Definitely not. So the brewers race to the farmer. It's not the other way around. Gone are the days of the farmer peddling his wares. Hop production in the U.S. almost disappeared because it's for a long time a really low value commodity. It's coming back for a lot of reasons. One of them being that it's relatively lower resource intensive than, say, grapes. A lot of these hops come from Washington, that kind of 46 parallel, if you will. That's kind of like regarded as the latitude where hops are the best. It's kind of like the Czech area. All of the hops, the notable ones from around the world kind of come from that area. So wine is big there, but hops need a lot less in terms of, human and input as well. So new hops are bred. It's a pretty crazy deal. So if you have a tomato and you plant all the seeds in it, it's going to grow. Each seed is going to grow the same tomato plant. Hops are not like that. Each seed has different genetics. So to go from a seed to the next Simcoe is literally a 1 in a million. I mean, I had the privilege of touring two of our farms near Yakima, Washington, Roy Farms and Peralt Farms, and they're responsible for breeding some of the badassest hops there are in the world. But the breweries are coming to them for these hops. They plant a whole field of seedlings and immediately kill all the males, all the ones that are susceptible to mold or insects, and any undesirable sort of traits when they're this big. If you get through that, you go to a field, they call it Hill 1, where every plant in the acre is different. Single plant. And at that point, they're looking, does this grow tall enough for our mechanical harvesters? Are the cones too loose? Or do they rot on the vine before they're ripe? Is there too much leaves that's going to mess up the machines? But they're looking for all these different things that aren't really related to the hop itself. It's more about the plant. And then from there, if they like it, it gets 3 years of Hill 1. From there, if they like it, it gets 3 years of Hill 7, where every 7 plants in a field is a different hop. At that point, it'll get a number. A hop breeding company number 366 became Equinox. So at that point, it will get its number, Hill 7. Gets that for 3 years. Usually they'll make a beer with it. They're looking more at the chemical analytics of the hop cone itself. And then they'll give it a whole acre, and if it works, it'll become a hop. But it literally coming out of that field, out of the seed, is 1 in a million. They just breed it back with neutral male pollen to stabilize it over time. So it's pretty interesting process. I don't know nearly as much about it as I would like to. I learned all of this in September when we toured the farm. So hops are really the next. This is not yeast related at all, obviously. Hops are the next like bottleneck in craft brewing. The craft beer is like 20% of the volume of beer being made, but they use like 70% of the hops being grown. So there's a huge, intersection coming up where the availability of hops rather than the availability of water or whatever is going to be the next thing that slows down the growth of craft beer unless we proliferate hops much more rapidly. But Lagunitas has partnered with these farms to help, bear the cost of, and it's a risk-sharing model basically to buy whatever they grow no matter how it comes out, to sort of sponsor different strains and keep it going, keep our relationship deep. What's betting on it? Yeah.
So there's a whole thing with Wisconsin used to be huge, one of the major hop
Sure.
producers in North America, and then they have fungus that would throw blight now.
Right.
And then the second thing is on this Tuberfest.
Yeah.
I'll be honest, it smells like pot. Anybody else get that? Gotta start the conversation somewhere, right?
Nelson.
It smells like marijuana, like pot.
Are you familiar with Nelson Sauvin hops in general? Originally, I believe, bred in New Zealand, and it's got an extraordinarily distinct aromatic. I mean, and this is minimally Nelson-y. I mean, a really Nelson hoppy beer is quite different than this. But the little bit of Nelson in there, I can very much see what you're saying. It's a grassier hop. It's definitely less of the citrus that you get in the Simcoe Mosaic Citra. Yeah, yeah. I'm glad it makes you happy, man. Me too. Sure. Right, and I think Lagunitas is really neat in general in the sense that almost all of the beers are hoppy in that they have a lot of hops in them, but hops and bitterness do not necessarily have to be the same thing. High IBU and lots of hops are not mutually exclusive, sort of automatically related in that way. In Lagunitas, a lot of our beers, I think, showcase other aspects of hops other than bitterness. So if you think you don't like hoppy beer, jump around to something like a little something, have a Pilsner. All of our beers are hoppy, but they're not all bitter and whatever. So lager yeast, I know that was more of a hoppy conversation, but I don't know anything about our marketing team. I work only in the sales, and it's literally like this dark side of the moon world where the marketing dudes make up festivals and do stuff, and I'm not personally a social media sort of cat, so I don't really know, but I will find out for you. Yeah. That was for like Born Yesterday, right? Interesting. Anyway, yeah, I would imagine there's some relationship there, although I don't know what it is. So Tuberfest, lager, cold fermentation, also sort of flavorless, maybe breadier and sort of somewhat more substantial, but not a primary flavor agent. Feeling good about that all? We're jumping around like crazy, I know. I'm super sorry. There's a lot to say. Cool. Yeah, well, that's just from the grain, I would say. All right, next up we have Stoopid Wit. So this is like really cool yeast. Really cool. So wit beer traditionally is a beer of Belgium, an unfiltered raw white wheat, malted wheat-based beer. Low alcohol, traditionally brewed with orange and coriander. Give it a sort of summery brightness, herbaceous quality. And then Belgian yeast. This is really an amazing expression of what Belgian yeast is. And unlike any of the beers we've had so far, this is intentionally flavored by yeast. Our Stoopid Wit is not really a wit at all, in that there's no orange or coriander in it. It's quite a bit stronger than traditionally would be, allowed for, and it's also super, super hoppy. But the yeast is right. The yeast is Westmalle wit yeast. They're one of the Belgian Trappist certified, monks are making this beer. They only have a few flavors. They've been doing it since the 1830s. with continuous propagation of this very yeast. So the yeast has been fed and grown and cultured to live forever. I mean, I know they keep it in safes in case things happen like earthquakes and fires, that they still have their living cultures and stuff. So this is like a treasure of Belgium, this particular strain of yeast. Among the Rochefort and the Chimay strains, some of the other monks do the same thing. Fermented really warm. Belgian yeast, the warmer, all yeast really, but in Belgian yeast it tastes good. The warmer it's fermented, the more of this fruity, spicy, sort of floral brightness you get out of it. So if you smell this beer, I mean, everyone smells something different, but what you're smelling is the byproducts of the yeast at these warmer temperatures. Very cool. Very cool. Yeah, I know they founded their abbey in the 1790s sometimes, started making beer in the 1830s, maybe 36 or 4. So it's been going on for a really long time. We're lucky to have this yeast in this beer, and we definitely fermented it warm. Like this yeast was allowed to be itself and run kind of wild. So this is really what Belgian yeast, it's an ale yeast. I have to imagine the fermentation temperature of this beer is high 70s. I mean, it's warm. Warm to a degree that other ale yeast would taste absolutely terrible fermented this way. You can taste this, appreciate this sort of spicy, white peppery, sort of citric, bitter flavors, floral, maybe honey, clover, things like that. It's like ancient in a way, but then it's brand new because it's super hoppy, and it's also sort of filtered and stylistically disastrous. But the beer tastes really good and really different. So. Sure. Yeah. Totally. I think there was some play with Hop Stoopid, which is a popular double IPA that we've been making for 20 years or something. So I think there's a relationship there that it's supposed, if you know Lagunitas, you know it'll be hoppy. But I agree, it's a bizarre thing to call this a wit beer and expect to reach the normal Belgian or wheat beer consumer. It's too hoppy. It's Lagunitas. All of our beer is like that. It's fun. Yeah. Questions, thoughts? Belgian wit yeast? Well, I have a master's in environmental science and management, and then I have another master's in international development economics. So I have 2 that were separate. Thanks. I have a lot of student debt, and I'm not paying it off. If anyone wants to help me fake my death. How did that prepare me? I don't know. Maybe being somewhat articulate, I hope. I don't know. Like, learn to think on the fly and be critical of stuff and super aware and try to be always learning. You know, there's always more to know, I guess. I'm not unhappy. I love my job. Lagunitas is fucking awesome, and because sour beer is all the rage. This is like the shit. Everyone wants to talk about sour beer. Everybody wants to make it. Everyone thinks they can. And everyone can. It ain't a secret. For a long time, the sour beers were these long, woody, Belgian, open fermented, fully wild, no cultured yeast, lambic, goose, creek, that kind of thing. Now, it's an American phenomenon. Sour beer covers an enormous range of styles, and there are a lot of ways to make it. Open fermentation, petri dish, cool ship, capture wild yeast from the atmosphere and let it do its thing is a long, slow, closely regulated process that most American brewers are not doing. This is a traditional thing. It's very dependent on what's in the air. So, I mean, metropolitan St. Louis does not yield the same thing as the Seine Valley, for example, right? It just cannot possibly be. So we have resurrected some of these processes, largely derived from old German styles, Gose and Berliner Weiss, which would be the sour mash or the kettle sour, which are basically shorter, quicker, somewhat cleaner processes to produce acidity in beer. And this can be done in a number of ways. It's not something Lagunitas ever did outside of the brewery. There was always a few kegs of this, a few kegs of that, but people are only now starting to see with Aunt Sally that came out in May. If people had Aunt Sally, it's a dry hop sour wheat beer. On draft here, yeah, we'll have around after this. It's the first sour beer that we've released on any kind of scale at all, so it's pretty neat, and there's going to be a lot more. Dark Swan that we're getting passed out right now is sort of the next one-hitter beer for one. It's the next expression of sour beer coming out of Lagunitas. Unique in that some 30% of the fermentable sugar in this beer is Petite Syrah grape juice, like pressed, added in with the wort, fermented right along with the grain. It's not two separate fermentations. It's not rested on fruit. It's not barrel aged. That's the purple color. That's the tang, some of the tang. Yeah. Yeah, the juice of the grape. Some. Sure.
All grapes make white juice.
Right.
It's the skin contact that gives it the color.
Exactly.
So there is skin contact with this.
Yes. Mm-hmm. Yep. Totally. Yeah. It's
There are a few grapes. I think there's like 3 or 4 strands of grapes actually produce grape, like purple juice.
Right.
Purple juice. But all grapes, no matter what, produce
Right.
white.
It's pretty raw. There's blended in. So pre-fermentation, which is interesting, but the process that this beer is made with is sort of like a sour mash or kettle sour. We call it a hot side sour when the liquid is all still warm, far warmer than fermentation temperatures would be. Couple of ways to do this. There's so this is an isolated single strain of lactobacillus, which is one of the many, many, many possible isolatable, culturable agents of sour fermentation. Sour because instead of just CO2 and alcohol, they also produce these bizarre acids, citric acid, lactic acid, tannins, malic acid, even in some of the harsher beers. So there's a lot of different compounds that come out of fermentation at extremely high temperatures. I mean, 90 to 115 is happy place for a lactose strain. So this is an isolated single strain, which is semi-unique to Lagunitas, totally controlled by temperature, and lactobacillus exists on all grains. So a sour mash would be to make wort, rest the beer, the liquid on the grain, and allow it to cool down enough that stuff starts to grow. And that might take 48 hours or something, but at the scale the size of Lagunitas, it's pretty tricky to consistently sour mash to the same specifications. The starch conversion changes as the pH changes. The cells grow at different rates depending on ambient temperature of the brew house, it's just a little bit less controllable. So ours is mashed and pulled off of the grain, and there's actually a lactobacillus pitch added to the beer. And it sits, sometimes it's 18 hours. I think it can go up to close to 2 days, just depending on the rate at which it's working, all controlled by temperature. And then it's brought into the kettle and boiled. And the boil kills all of the bacteria which can contaminate your brew house and mess things up. But it retains all of the other stuff that it produces. It keeps the acid in the beer, hence sour beer. So it goes through normal boil, hops are added, fruit juice is added, is fermented with the same yeast that we tasted in the nighttime. So this is fermented with our house ale yeast, but retains its acidity from the souring process on the front end. which is a pretty unique way to make beer, I would say, owing back to the Germans and their Berliner Weiss styles. It's actually all brewed in the same facility. So there's much lower risk of contamination in the brew house when you make hot side sour beer, sour mashed, kettle soured beer, because you're not having a fermentation process occur uncontrolled or wild. There's no Brettanomyces, which is much more like atmospherically dangerous. Swab the bottom of any mash tun in the country at any brewery, and there's a whole, ooh, we good? There's a whole bunch of bacterial elements that can infect beer in every brewery in the country. It's just the way that they're controlled, you know. So this is carefully controlled, and they took a long time to get it right and sort of slowly wheel it out with Aunt Sally. But it's a process that they love, and something that we're going to probably see a lot more of coming from Lagunitas, especially with these different fruit options. I think you get some cool acidity from the grapes as well.
Here, I'm not saying that. All right, 1 vote per person. If the first beer, nighttime, was your favorite beer, raise your hand. The first beer.
Awesome.
All right, well. Okay, second beer was Gnarlywine. Many people like that beer.
Cool.
Right
cool,
on, that's a big
cool.
chunk of folks. All right.
Drink it up then.
Yeah, for sure. How about Tuberfest? A few people. All right.
Wow.
All right. And that's right. Stoopid Wit. Stupid, the unwit.
Lone Ranger.
Unwit, stupid.
All
something
right.
like that. All right. Well, how about which one? Stoopid Wit will not be back last year, so if you hated it, you don't have to buy it next year. Okay. Dark Swan. How many people wow, look at that.
Awesome.
That's pretty good across the board.
Totally.
Well, you know, this before we give away stuff, the intent of this class was a little different than a lot of the other classes we've done this semester. Instead of just tasting a bunch of, you know, sort of flagship beers from Lagunitas, which most of us have had already, I really wanted to do something different, give you some things you haven't had. So I think that all the beers we tasted today were really, really different. So I hope that you guys enjoyed and appreciated that. Right on.